this is a follow-up to the training that we did earlier this year. So earlier this year, we had a Rad Health team interest meeting, and all of you attended that meeting and then indicated that you would wish to be a part of the Rad Health team going forward. We thought that we would have your follow-up training earlier in the year, but other events sort of took precedence within the agency, and so we're just now getting to the first part of this training, and this is the EAC support mission, the Evacuation Assembly Center support mission that we talked about during that interest meeting. So tonight, Matt Enninger from the Virginia Department of Health Office of Rad Health will be giving an overview of that mission. And then we're going to have some test questions at the end. It's going to be a group test. So, take notes, but don't feel too much pressure. And then there'll be also an opportunity for you guys to ask questions throughout as well. Let me introduce Matt Enninger. So Matt is the Director Division of Environmental Monitoring and Emergency Preparedness in the Office of Radiological Health in the Virginia Department of Health. Matt has been a division director within the Office of Rad Health since 2015. He has worked for the Commonwealth of Virginia for 23 years in various positions at the Division of Consolidated Laboratory Services, or DCLS as we call it, the Virginia Cooperative Extension, the Chesterfield Health District, and the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Also with him tonight is Susan Binkley, who's also with the Office of Radiological Health. The two of them will be presenting tonight. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Mike. Let me share my screen here. All right. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Okay. So as Mike said, we're going to go through the presentation tonight is designed to introduce the concept. First off, I'm going to cover a little bit about radiological emergencies at the plant. This may be a bit of review from some of the stuff we've already went over, and some of it'll be new. And then Susan's going to cover more specifics about what actually goes on at the EACs, or the Evacuation Assembly Centers. We have floated the idea of using MRC volunteer teams at the EACs to the localities located within the emergency planning zones around both power plants, and they have so far they haven't really given a lot of interest back, but we're going to try to get something set up prior to the North Anna exercise in 2024, where maybe we can put some of this into practice. Just as a review, the idea behind this is that the volunteers would be a support to the EAC mission, basically filling in as needed at the EAC for whatever, but also drawing on your past experience, particularly experience in radiation medicine, military radiation applications, etc., that you become somewhat of a subject matter expert that could speak to people entering the EAC about the incident and concerns that they might have about radiological exposure, contamination, etc. Mike mentioned there's going to be some questions at the end. I wouldn't put a lot of worry on that. I honestly don't think half of my office could answer all the questions that we've got for this thing today, so no pressure there. So getting started, like I said, I'm going to cover a little bit about power plant emergencies. So we talk about in a situation at one of the state's nuclear power plants, they are classified, the events are classified by 4 emergency classification levels. We call them ECLs. And they go from increasing order of severity from an unusual event, which is something not very severe, all the way up to a general emergency. On this slide, you can kind of see a breakdown of basic information about what each level entails. I'm not going to read all this. It's busy. If you want a copy of the slides later, we can make those available. I think they're maybe even recording this. So essentially what I want to point out here is a couple of things. First thing first is that again, you go up in severity, and what can drive the increase in severity and the increase from one classification level to the next, there's a lot of things. It can be driven by conditions at the plant. So as things deteriorate at the plant, we move from a lesser serious issue like an unusual event or an alert all the way up to a site area or a general emergency. It can be driven by radiological factors, so the amount of radiation in certain areas of the plant or detectable radiation outside of the plant can drive escalation of the event as well. So just keeping that out. And the other thing I want to point out is if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll notice that at any of these event classifications, you can have radiological releases from the plant. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize is that at any point you can have a release of radiation from the plant. What drives where it's classified is the amount. And a little bit more information about the ECLs. Again, I already said they increase sequentially based on plant conditions or risk to the public. I already pointed out that a radiological release can occur at any ECL. Generally, and this is pretty much always true, actions to protect the public are not initiated till the general emergency is declared. So prior to that, very little information is communicated to the public prior to the general emergency. And generally, there's not a lot told to the public before the general emergency and before the development of protective actions. One of the things that we just found out in our most recent North or Surrey exercise is that radiation levels outside of the plant boundary can be significantly above background and still not drive an event to a general emergency, which creates some issues when you think of it in a political sense versus the rep world. So up to 400 times background or higher can be reported outside of the plant boundary, and it doesn't drive us to the general emergency, which doesn't drive information to the public and development of protective actions. So one of the things that can drive us through the various levels of severity of a plant incident are the integrity of the 3 fission product barriers at the plant. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to point it out because this is something that you may hear talked about during an event. So there are, as I said, 3 fission product barriers. The first of those barriers is the fuel cladding. So again, that's the cladding material, the material surrounding the uranium fuel pellets in the reactor. And I don't know if y'all can see my pointer, but essentially what we're talking about is the fuel in the reactor here. So the integrity of the cladding around the nuclear fuel is our first barrier. Our second barrier is the reactor coolant system. That's the water that flows through the reactor and keeps the fuel cool. One of the things about nuclear power, anybody that's worked in it understands everything is relative. So cool is relative. For example, the water going through the reactor, when it comes out of the reactor and goes into the steam generator, is upwards of 600-700 degrees, maybe even higher. When it comes back, it's down around 500 to 600 degrees, and so they call that cool. So it's relatively speaking. But again, the second barrier is the reactor coolant system. If we can't keep the fuel cool, then the integrity of the fuel clad barrier goes down really quickly. And then the last barrier is the containment building itself. So at Surrey and North Anna, that's the big domes that are over the reactors and all of their components. As each one of these degrades during an incident, it can drive us further and further along in the classification of that incident, all the way again from notice of unusual event all the way up to a general emergency. So when we talk about that, they will say things like there was a loss or potential loss of a barrier. So the loss of a barrier, pretty straightforward, means that barrier no longer assures containment of the radioactive materials. Potential loss, again, pretty self-explanatory, means it may have been lost or it is likely to be lost if the situation continues to deteriorate. And then at the bottom there of this slide, you can see that at the alert, we have the loss or potential loss of either the fuel clad or RCS barrier. So if we meet either of those criteria, it automatically drives the situation to an alert classification. If we have the loss or potential loss of any of the two barriers, it drives us to a site area emergency. And then if we have the loss of any two barriers combined with the loss or potential loss of the third barrier, that automatically drives the event to a general emergency. And again, this classification increase or increase in the severity of the incident and the increasing ECL level can be driven with or without a radiological release going on at that time. So what do we do about an incident at the plant? I mentioned before that we don't really initiate protective actions until we get to the general emergency. And there are essentially two types of protective actions that we utilize in the Commonwealth of Virginia and pretty much in all states to protect the public during an event. The first is shelter in place. Shelter in place is primarily used during hostile action-based events. Essentially, it's an idea of putting people in their homes so that we know that citizens aren't going to be mistaken as the bad guys. The last thing you need is a lot of people wandering around within the emergency planning zone when law enforcement and other groups are trying to deal with a hostile action or a hostile attack on the power plant or the materials or the infrastructure around the plant. Essentially, shelter in place means go inside, stay inside, and listen for further instructions. The instructions are going to include that you're going to want to turn off your HVAC systems, which, as you can imagine, in the middle of the summer or the middle of winter, something that can't be done long term. There's also the issue of that the air inside the home fairly quickly becomes the same as the air outside the home. So if we actually do have a radiological release, we can only shelter in place for so long before we start to expose people within the home just through natural exchange of the air. We're going to try to seal up the home to the best of our ability. As I kind of already indicated, it provides limited protection from radiation exposure. Primarily, it's preventing us from getting contaminated because it's blocking the fallout material from getting on our bodies, the home, the structure of the home itself. And then just by the nature of that, you're not right against it, the distance from that radiological contamination and the energy that it's giving off, that distance also reduces your overall exposure. And the primary impact really is prevention of contamination, as I said, particularly inhalational hazards. The second protective action, the one that we use most often in events that are not hostile action based and almost exclusively when it's not hostile action based, is evacuation. So when we talk about evacuation, what does that mean? How does that look? So this is this kind of shows what a standard protective action recommendation would look like around one of the nuclear power plants. So the dot in the middle would represent the power plant, and then the circles represent distances of 2, 5, and 10 miles away from the plant. This is what we call a standard protective action recommendation, or PAR. So our standard PAR, standard evacuation, is a 0 to 2 mile 360 around the plant, and then a 2 to 5 mile in the 3 downwind sectors. So you can see the wind in this is coming from the pretty much due west. And so the affected sectors are Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot. So again, we're evacuating 2 to 5 miles in those sectors, and then 0 to 2, 360 around the plant itself. Again, this is the standard PAR. This can be put out at the GE with or without a radiological release. This slide kind of shows how we would escalate. So if radiological conditions continue to deteriorate and dose assessment starts to show that we're going to exceed the allowable radiation levels or exposure levels outside of that 2-mile circle that we already set up, we get an expanded PAR. Right now, currently in Virginia, an expanded PAR is we expand to a 0 to 5-mile circle around the affected power plant, and then 5 to 10 miles downwind in the 3 affected downwind sectors. So you can kind of see how that looks here on these two diagrams. But that's not really how we put out protective actions to the public, because we don't tell people everybody in sector C evacuate or anything like that. We actually do evacuations by protective action zones, or PAZs. So this is a map that shows the North Anna Power Station in the middle is the dot, and the protective action zones that are established around the plant. And then we have the ability to then overlay that diagram that I showed before with the 0 to 2, 0 to 5, and 0 to 10 mile circles represented, along with the sectors, the pass slices, if you will, around the power plant. So this is a way to overlay that on it so we can start to see how things are affected in terms of the PAZs. We also have the ability, using GIS mapping, to pull up and look at how heavily populated are the areas that we're talking about. And the amount of population in an area can really drive whether a PAZ is actually included in a protective action or not. One of the things that we play around a lot with protective action development is, do we want to evacuate an entire PAZ if just a small portion of it is impacted by the evacuation zone, that 0 to 2, 2 to 5, or 0 to 5, 5 to 10 that I showed before. So we can look at that and we can say, well, not many people live in that, or there are no inhabitable structures in that area. So no, we're not going to include that PAZ in the evacuation. So we have that ability as well. Here you can see if we took a standard PAR, a 0 to 2 mile 360, a 2 to 5 in the downwind sectors. And in this case, the downwind sectors are Charlie, Delta, and Echo, which are right here. You can see the PAZs that are pulled into that by either touching the 0 to 2 mile 360 or the affected downwind sectors. So when we put out the protective action, it's going to say people in the following PAZs, and it's going to go through and name all those, are going to evacuate. And then this is just a blown up diagram of that previous one, showing again how we can look at how heavily populated are the areas that we're looking to evacuate. And do we really want to include them, or do we not? Do we want to exclude them from the protective action? And then this is showing, this is kind of a little bit more difficult to understand. This is a diagram showing if we did a 0 to 5 mile all the way around the plant at Surrey, how many people would be pulled in. So you can, you can see that if we expand out, if we have an expanded PAR that involves a 0 to 5, 360 around the plant, how many PAZs get pulled in and how quickly we can start increasing our population. If you remember, an expanded PAR is actually the 0 to 5 mile 360 and then 5 to 10 downwind. So when you start going north of Surrey Power Plant, you very quickly start pulling in extremely large numbers of individuals. So again, the decision of making a protective action is not taken lightly, because we know we're putting all of those people on the road if we do go to that extent. I already went over that basically plant conditions can drive a PAR or a protective action recommendation. It is we always have a PAR whenever we upgrade to a general emergency, regardless of any radiological releases. And as I said, evacuation is the default to protective action outside of a HAB incident. I don't know that you'll ever need to know this, and I don't know that anyone would ever ask you this, but I think people find it interesting. So that in Virginia, there are 3 radiological factors that we use to determine if we need to evacuate and if we need to, particularly if we need to expand an evacuation. We can get these radiological factors either through dose assessment. So that is software that the utility and the state run to estimate doses to the public at certain distances from the plant based upon the conditions at the plant and any releases going on. Or it can be from actual field data where we have people in the field collecting actual radiation measurements with calibrated equipment. So the first thing we look for is at what distance do we exceed, will doses to the public be greater than 1 rem, what they call TEDI or total effective dose equivalent. So that's a whole body dose. Anytime we exceed a 1 rem dose, TEDI dose, we're going to expand to that distance. So for example, if dose assessment shows that we're going to exceed the 1 rem TEDI at 2.5 miles, because that's beyond 2 miles, we will automatically do a 0 to 5 360 evacuation, and then the 5 to 10 in the downwind sectors. If the exceedance of the 1 rem TEDI was at, say, 1.7 miles, because that's inside the 2 mile circle, we would stick with the standard PAR, which again is a 0 to 2 360, 2 to 5 downwind. The other protective action factor that we use in Virginia is the adult thyroid dose. So dose specifically to the thyroid, particularly looking at the impact of radioactive iodines released from the plant. And in that, we look at an exceeding a dose of 5 rem to the thyroid for the adult. What's interesting about that is a few years ago, I think it was 2017, EPA made the 5 rem adult thyroid dose, which used to be mandatory in terms of developing protective actions, voluntary. So states could choose to either use it or not. Virginia was one of the states that opted to keep using that, but there are states out there now that no longer use that in determining protective actions. They only look at the 1 rem whole body dose. The last radiological factor that we look at in an incident is for issuance of potassium iodide, which, if you don't know, potassium iodide is essentially a salt that we can take and flood our thyroid with healthy iodine or normal iodine, which will block the receptors so that radioactive iodine that we might inhale or ingest during the event cannot bind to the thyroid. The potassium iodide, we give that when dose assessment, again, or field data indicates there's a greater than 5 rem child thyroid dose anywhere outside of the plant boundary. So how do we get a protective action recommendation, and what's the process for getting that out to the public? So during a radiological emergency, the utility, Dominion Energy, along with representatives from Virginia Department of Health and the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, are co-located at Dominion Energy's Corporate Emergency Response Center, or CERC. And at that facility, they're monitoring plant conditions. They're getting reports from people on site at the plant about what's going on. They get the ECLs, or the emergency classification level that's currently being used, is communicated from the plant to this facility. So they're monitoring all this. And when they reach the point at which a protective action recommendation is needed, either going to a general emergency or dose assessment indicating that we need to develop a PAR, it is developed out of this facility. And so the utility, Dominion Energy in this case, comes up with an initial protective action notification or recommendation. And then I point out this room. This is a secondary room in that facility. They have one for North Anna and one for Surrey. And inside this dose room, Dominion Energy staff that are conducting dose assessment, as well as managing their field teams, are co-located with Virginia Department of Health staff, who are also running dose assessment and managing the state field teams. And this is where we get a lot of the data that drives the radiological determination of any protective actions. So once the utility PAR is developed, it's communicated to the State Emergency Operations Center, the EOC. At the EOC, the state, and this is the kind of a picture showing the new process. These are actually pictures out of the Surrey exercise from this July. They get together, we call it the PAR PAG group, or the Protective Action Task Force gets together, and they start looking at what is the utility's protective action recommendation. Do we agree with that recommendation? Do we want to expand it? Do we want to make it smaller? We look at factors like comparison of utility dose assessment to state dose assessment. And they make a decision on what protective action do they then want to go forward with. Once they determine that, then they go to the next step, which is once a state protective action recommendation is developed, and sometimes that agrees with the utility PAR. It usually does, but it doesn't have to. That PAR is communicated to all of the emergency planning zone localities. So all the counties and cities located within the 10-mile emergency planning zone, that PAR is communicated to all of them, that state PAR. If all the localities agree with the proposed state PAR, it is then presented to the state coordinator, which is essentially the director of the Department of Emergency Management, or her designee. If the state coordinator approves of the state PAR, it is then presented to the governor and or his or her designee. And once approved by the governor, that PAR, the protective action recommendation, now becomes a protective action decision. It's official. And then that protective action decision is communicated to the localities, where it is then communicated out to the public, and then it's started to put into action. They operationalize that protective action decision. So this is kind of the end of my slides, but some things I want to point out, and the reason that we feel like having subject matter experts at the EACs are very important. Some general things about radiation and the public, and I think most people who've worked in the field know this. People fear anything they don't understand. And the lack of understanding of radiation in the general public is astounding. So there's going to be a lot of fear. There's going to be a lot of concern. Radiation is an unseen threat. You can't see it, smell it, taste it. You can't even realistically feel it when you're being exposed. So there's no way to know that you're in a radiation field if you don't have the equipment to measure it. So it's fearsome. If there's contamination, like for example, in this last exercise we did in July, the conditions around the plant and the wind speed essentially assured that once we got the protective action decision out to the folks that were being evacuated, by the time that information was communicated to them, the plume was already going to be over them, which means they're going to be evacuating in the middle of the plume, which means there's going to be a lot of contaminated people and vehicles. The presence of contamination at an EAC, when they walk through the screening and the equipment starts to beep, is going to escalate fear and anxiety. If you go through decontamination, they're going to take your stuff. If your car is contaminated, they take the car. If you are contaminated, they're going to take your jewelry. They're going to take your everything basically on your body, right? Because one of the easiest ways to decontaminate is just removing our outer clothing. So decontamination, loss of possessions, it adds to stress, it adds to anxiety, it adds to fear. Emergencies and evacuations are already extremely stressful. When you combine it with all the other things we already talked about, it just escalates that. Pets and livestock may have been left behind. That creates a lot of issues for people as well. There are only certain types of animals that'll be accepted at the EACs. Essentially, people are evacuating with almost no notice in this. So they're abandoning most or all of their possessions, And there's a question of, will they ever be able to return and get that? And then, as I kind of pointed out at the beginning, few individuals have even a basic understanding of radiation, and even basic radiation principles can be very difficult to grasp. And that creates a lot of the issues that we've talked about. So that's me talking for way too long about what radiological emergencies are and how we deal with them. And now Susan's going to talk more specifics about the evacuation assembly centers and the missions there.
You're going to go to the next slide for me. So good evening, everyone. Susan Binkley. I work with Matt Ettinger, and just a quick little background about myself. So prior to joining Office of Radiological Health about 6 years ago, I spent the majority of my career, 20 years, with Virginia Department of Emergency Management, working in the radiological emergency preparedness program. So Matt asked me to kind of speak to evacuation assembly centers tonight, just because I do have some experience working with localities over the years in the planning and actual exercising of their evacuation assembly centers. So before we get into the roles and responsibilities of an evacuation assembly center, as a reminder, you know, we may have covered this in the last presentation, but kind of a quick reminder of what local health districts' role in the radiological emergency preparedness program. So our district emergency coordinators have the responsibility to review and revise the health department annex. And that annex is actually contained or incorporated into the local jurisdiction radiological emergency response plan. In addition, local health district personnel are asked to provide technical support and medical advice to that local EOC to which they are which they have joined in a response, as well as to provide personnel to the evacuation assembly center. They can maintain communications with the ESF-8 or the emergency support function at the Virginia Emergency Operations Center. ESF-8, for those that don't know, is our public health and medical function for the state. So that's where you'll have the state level health decision makers would be working from there. Again, we kind of talked about providing staff at the evacuation assembly center. And lastly, the main responsibility for local health districts at an EAC is to actually distribute potassium iodide for emergency workers and the general public. Okay, next. So what is an EAC? Again, evacuation assembly center. So whether we call it a shelter or an evacuation assembly center, the primary purpose is to provide shelter for displaced individuals. So prior to a general emergency that Matt kind of talked about earlier, personnel will be asked to go to the evacuation assembly center and start getting it set up. And you can kind of see on the right-hand side some pictures of what they're doing prior to receiving any evacuees. So they're going to go ahead and set up the entrance area where individuals will actually walk through the portal monitor. You can kind of see that in that middle picture there. There's a lot that has to be done prior to accepting evacuees. Outside, they're going to set up areas to do vehicle monitoring. And then inside, the registration or social services individuals are going to be setting up a registration area. And then the health department as well is going to be setting up an area where they would distribute the potassium iodide if needed. EAC should be located at least 15 miles from the power station. In the majority of cases, they're actually further than 15 miles. And again, we kind of talked about the EAC functions as a shelter during a non-radiological emergency. So it's kind of understood in a local emergency response plan that should people begin to self-evacuate prior to an actual decision by our governor to evacuate, and before any kind of radiological release to the environment, the facilities aren't going to turn people away. They're just not going to perform any radiological monitoring. They would just invite people in, try to help them with whatever fears they have, or educate them on what's going on at the plant. All right, next slide. These two graphics on the left side, I hope it's your left side, is the Surrey Power Station area, and on the other side is North Anna. And Matt kind of talked earlier about the 2, 5, and 10 mile sector rings. You can kind of see those on the graphic, as well as the protective action zones that he also talked about. You can see those on the graphic as well. What these maps show you are the actual evacuation assembly centers for each emergency planning zone. So they are all currently schools. So again, at the local level, they're going to, if this were to happen during a regular school day, they're early on, they're going to move school children out of those schools to begin setting them up for evacuation assembly centers. So again, you can kind of see by the graphic around each one of the power stations, and you can also kind of see how far beyond the 10-mile planning zone ring these facilities are located. This information is also sent out to residents around the power stations each year. They have been using calendars, and I think, like Matt talked about earlier, they're moving towards a different method of sharing this preparedness information in the future. So if you ever have, or if you do live within one of those planning 10-mile emergency planning zones, you may be familiar with the calendar, and kind of looking forward to what the new changes are going to be coming up. All right, next. So I'm going to talk through the different functions within the EAC. And again, these are staffed by local emergency management, local government agencies. They can ask for state assistance, but again, the primary responsibility is on the locality itself. You always have an EAC manager, and from my experience, that can either be someone from the local emergency management office. Normally, it's whoever would be a shelter manager in any other type of hazard where they open a shelter. So in some instances, that could be someone with the local social services department, just depending on what resources they have at the local level. I've even seen where the Red Cross comes in and they manage the shelter themselves. So one of the responsibilities of that EAC manager, should it be someone from that locality, would be to coordinate with Red Cross and what types of support they would need from the Red Cross. The EAC manager is also responsible to maintain communications with the local emergency operations center. So should they have a need for resources or equipment or extra personnel, that individual would have the responsibility for making that request up through the local EOC. The EAC manager has the authority to activate the facility. So like we talked earlier, if it's prior to an evacuation of the public, the facility is usually not activated. However, as we talked about before, if individuals were to show up, they certainly wouldn't be turned away. They're going to maintain a knowledge and receive updates from all functional areas. So the EAC manager, like in any incident, is going to become the incident commander. And again, maintain knowledge of what's going on in each area of the EAC, just to keep any kind of support and resources flowing throughout the facility. They're going to ensure the proper flow of monitoring and processing of evacuees, mainly because we get into the next bullet point to ensure contamination control. So as evacuees come in, there's going to be a designated pathway for individuals to come into the facility. And we'll kind of get into that a little more as we go through the next couple of slides. All right, next. So sheltering staff, as I mentioned before, sheltering staff can be made up of local social services, Red Cross, it could be volunteers. We've seen it done many different ways, just depending on what resources the locality has. They're responsible for registering evacuees, providing bedding, food, counseling, etc. So these individuals are going to be working closely with the EAC manager to ensure that any evacuees have the comfort features that they need, and as well as any types of counseling support, ensuring people's fears are addressed. They're also going to oversee the setup of congregate care. So again, making sure that just like in any shelter operation, there are places for the evacuees to go so that they are comfortable while they're there, as well as if there's any small children, that they have some things lined up to keep them occupied. And the good thing about the EACs within Virginia, they're in schools. So a lot of times you have gymnasiums that can be set up if they're not being used for congregate care, that is, if they have enough space to set up to do some recreational type activities, as well as libraries. And so that makes those schools a good choice for these facilities. We talked about ensuring enough supplies are available, and then moving a request up to the EAC manager should they need additional resources or supplies. And one of the most important things for the sheltering staff that are responsible for registering evacuees as they come in, before they do anything with an evacuee, they're going to ask to see a clean stamp on their hand. And the clean stamp it's just the way to know that they have been through the portal monitor, they have been monitored for contamination, and they're clean. And they literally have stamps that say clean. So again, that's very important. If someone doesn't present with a clean stamp, they would be directed back through to be monitored for contamination before they are registered and allowed into the congregate care section of the facility. All right, next. So here's where the good part comes in. So health department staff, and this is the planning that Matt and I do on a daily basis. The health department staff that are located at an evacuation assembly center are there to distribute KI to evacuees if it's authorized by the state commissioner of health. And again, there will never be any KI distributed without an authorization by the state commissioner of health. Once the commissioner has authorized that, in addition to let me back up, in addition to evacuees being given the KI, it would be an order for emergency workers as well. So they have that responsibility as well to provide KI to the emergency workers at the evacuation assembly center. Once the decision is made to authorize the KI and we begin that distribution at the EAC, when evacuees are provided with the KI tablets, they are also given a KI information sheet. And that health department is also responsible for explaining it to the evacuees and making sure that they understand the purpose of it. Health department staff are responsible to keep record of persons receiving KI. In addition to the KI distribution, we also have medical personnel available at the EAC to monitor for any types of adverse reactions to the individuals that ingest the KI. The way I've seen that done in the past is there's a separate area where once you ingest the KI, you go and you sit for, 15, 30 minutes or so. And health department staff are going to monitor those individuals just to make sure that they don't have issues with. Sorry, I think I hit my mute button by mistake. In addition, health department staff are going to coordinate with EMS if needed. So should there be an individual that is in need of medical attention or transportation to a hospital, health department staff may be asked to assist with that request as well. Replenishing KI supplies at the EAC, that's the primary responsibility for the health department staff. And again, like we've talked about before, just assisting with any types of concerns from the evacuees, and going back to the slide that Matt kind of ended with, we can only imagine the types of fears that people are going to have when it comes to being evacuated from their homes because of a radiological release. So we kind of feel like that's probably going to be one of the biggest areas of assistance that's needed in an EAC. All right, next. Another functional area is our at an EAC is an exposure control officer, and usually that's someone from the fire department or hazardous materials team, just depending on, again, how the locality runs that part of their operation. That individual is going to be providing a briefing to all the emergency workers within the facility. So that includes anyone working on the inside of the facility, those people performing registration, or health department, as well as the individuals working in the decontamination part of the center. All of those people need to be briefed and provided with proper dosimetry, the forms that they fill out. So if you're provided dosimetry, you are also provided with a form. It's called a Rec 1 form, and that form stays with the emergency worker throughout their mission to monitor any type of dose that they may receive. However, with an EAC being far outside of the emergency planning zone, that is something that we don't have a concern over being that far out. But again, they're provided the same briefings, dosimetry, and forms as an emergency worker working inside the planning zone would be. In Virginia, currently, EACs are also used for emergency workers that are working in the field. Once their mission is complete, they're directed to go to an EAC to be monitored and decontaminated if necessary. So one of the first things that an emergency worker does when they arrive at an EAC is drop their tools, right? So far away from the entrance to the EAC, there's a tool drop where their survey meters and dosimetry would be secured. They can be surveyed and deconned if needed. So again, EAC personnel would be manning that tool drop area and making sure that no equipment gets inside the facility. The exposure control officer is also responsible to remind all the emergency workers to check and record their dosimeter readings every 30 minutes. And as you see on the right, that's an individual actually checking their dosimeter, writing the information on their form Rec 1. At the end of the mission, the exposure control officer is going to collect all the paperwork and equipment. And again, in addition to the EAC manager, ensuring contamination control of the facility. So they're going to go behind where individuals are monitored, where they're deconned, and just make sure that the flow of traffic is moving so as to not contaminate other areas of the facility. All right, next. That brings me into radiation and contamination control. So contamination, and I think most of you probably know this, it's pretty elementary, but contamination is defined as the presence of radioactive material where it's not wanted. In our procedures here in Virginia, we have a limit that any person, vehicle, or object that reveals a measurement greater than 300 counts per minute above background indicates contamination. So on the right-hand side is just a picture of what the localities are currently using, which is a Ludlam survey meter. And they use that meter to measure for radiation, or excuse me, to measure for contamination on individuals, vehicles, and objects. So again, important, if it's not controlled, contamination can be spread to other people and things. So again, going back to the importance of those individuals that are responsible for maintaining control of different areas where there could be contamination. All right, next. So vehicle monitoring and decontamination. So this is the first thing that occurs when an evacuee arrives at an evacuation assembly center. They're going to be met by emergency workers who will survey their vehicle for contamination. And again, just to point out a couple of areas that they do actually monitor: the tire and wheel wells, because obviously if you've driven through any type of radiation, it's going to collect on your wheels and wheel wells, your bumpers, door handles, because if an individual is contaminated and their hands are contaminated, they've touched the door handles, steering wheel, floor, and seats. So that's the first thing that happens. They are then directed, if the vehicle screen's clean, to put a little green clean tag in the dashboard of the vehicle, and it's directed to a area to park, where then the evacuees can exit the vehicle and go through the portal monitor and into the facility. Lastly, if the vehicle screens that it's contaminated, depending on the facility, the procedures that they have in place, and how many vehicles they have, they can either decontaminate the vehicle, or they have the option to actually park vehicles in a contaminated parking area and deal with them later. So kind of, I'm keep referring back to the things that Matt said. You can imagine if someone's car is contaminated and you have someone saying, well, we're going to put your car over here and you're not going to get it back for a while. That's going to cause some distress. Okay, next. So these are a little out of order, so forgive me. The evacuee monitoring, the portal monitor that I've talked about throughout this presentation. Here's a picture of one of the drills done down in the Surrey area, and you can kind of see this one is the actual walkthrough portal monitor. There are some that are still out there that you actually have to stop and step on a plate and stand for it to take a reading. This is just an example of one that an individual can just walk through. If they walk through the portal monitor will alarm if it picks up on any radiation reading. If that's the case, the individual will be asked to step aside to another area, and they'll actually conduct a survey with a handheld meter to localize what area the contamination is present. At that point, it could be as simple as, removing clothing and then rescreening, and the individual will probably come back clean at that point. If they require a little more than that, they'll be escorted into in these facilities into the shower areas and asked to either, you know, wash their hands or their whatever part of their body might have picked up the contamination, or they could shower in those facilities. Then they will be rescreened again, and hopefully once they're decontaminated, they'll get a clean stamp and sent into the shelter to register, and then again to receive KI if the decision was made to issue KI. If they walk through the portal monitor and they're clean, it's pretty simple. They get a hand stamp, then they're sent to the shelter registration and KI tables within the EAC. All right, next. Well, that was it. So that didn't end very nicely, did it? So I'll turn that back over to Matt, and then I appreciate everyone's time tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I did collect some questions from the chat. If you guys don't mind answering some questions real quick.
No, that's fine. Just shoot and we'll try our best.
All right, the first two are from your section, Matt. One is, what are the levels of expected background radiation at these sites?
So it depends on the meter that you're using. So anybody who's worked in radiation field knows that your readings differ depending on what the size of your detector and sensitivity and various other factors. With the equipment that we give to our field staff, the 44.9, the pancake probe that Susan was showing in her slides that they use for contamination control, we usually see 50 to 80 counts per minute as the background. When we start checking those in, it can vary again by location. And then the meter that's actually used to conduct readings in the field by the field teams is called a 4438 or a hot dog probe. So it's a beta gamma probe only. Background on that one really varies quite a bit. So we see things as low as like, and that reads in dose rate. It doesn't read in counts per minute. So that can be as low as 20 micro rem or UR per hour. And we've seen them as high as 40 and 50, depending again on where we are. But it's always down in the low teen micro rem range. As a matter of fact, just to throw it out there, we tell our field teams when they're trying to determine if they're in a plume or not, that they have to get readings that are at least 100 UR per hour or higher before we consider that they're in any sort of radiological release.
And then the second one is, how would the instructions be communicated? I think it's instructions to the public.
So the evacuation instructions, it used to be that the sirens would go off and then you had to run inside and turn the radio on or the television on or whatever. The way it works now, and I don't know what this stands for, so everybody's got to excuse me because it's a VDEM thing and I don't know what their acronym stands for, but it's called IPAWS WIA. So essentially what happens is, instead of the siren going off and you running inside, it goes onto your cell phone. So it's a push notification to the cell phones, and it'll pop up with a little window that'll say there's something going on at the plant and here's what you're supposed to do. And then they follow up on instructions with that through the phones. They also then, for people who don't have phones, they have like usually police will go around and do route alerting, which is just notifying people on the evacuation routes that there's some sort of protective action that's out there. But anyways, that's how they're doing it now. I've seen it used. It's kind of neat. It's just not as readily, everybody kind of understood before, right? If the sirens go off, it's something really bad. I don't know that they've ever really tested this out, but it's the same ideas of the systems that they're using for all other disasters. They're just pushing the phones now.
And Matt, like when we get tornado warnings, we get those push notifications based on where you are relative to the tornado hazard. And I imagine it's the exact same system.
Yeah, and they actually they kind of fudge factored it a little bit. So instead of just the 10-mile EPZ, I think it pings all the towers within 13 miles so that they make sure that they catch everyone. What is not covered, and I've asked about this several times, and I got to be honest, I don't understand the technology. Is what if you're outside of that area and you're traveling, but you're planning to come back? Because you're not pinging one of those towers. I don't know that VDEM has ever answered that for us, but again, I don't know. So
Yeah, no
Great, thank
alerting
you.
system's perfect, but yeah, it sounds like this is the new technology and they're trying it out. I'm sure it'll continue to evolve.
yep.
And then the last few are from Susan's section. So this is specifically about EACs. Is this for the general public? Our EACs are only for non-essential employees, question mark. And then please address the availability or lack thereof of emergency evac centers.
So
And
again, the evacuation assembly centers, what was the first part of the question? I'm sorry.
is this for the general public?
Yes, so evacuation assembly centers are set up to receive evacuees, yes, from the general public. So those individuals who are asked to evacuate from their homes or businesses would be directed to one of those evacuation assembly centers. That's correct. And the second part?
It says our EACs are only for non-essential employees, question mark, and then please address the availability or lack thereof of emergency evac centers.
Okay, so unfortunately, I can't answer the question about the lack thereof because that's a emergency management function of the local jurisdictions. So I really can't speak to that question. I apologize, but sorry about that. Yeah.
Sorry. And so and then this is sort of the follow-up. The next one is, so you're talking about state evacuation centers?
No, so these are locality owned and operated evacuation assembly centers that are designated for nuclear power plant emergencies only, right? They're very different from a shelter that would be opened in a other type of a hazard or event. So these are very specific facilities for radiological nuclear power plant emergencies.
And then will the same maps apply to the mini reactors the governor is promoting?
You want me to take that one, Susan?
I would love for you to take that one.
So no, the same maps will not apply to those. So the planning zone around these small modular reactors is much, much smaller. It's not a 10-mile circle. It's not even a 2-mile circle around those. What we're trying to determine in Virginia, and the jury's still out on the small nuclear reactors as a whole, is most of them are going to be built in places where the planning zone around that small reactor won't include any people. So then the question becomes, do you really need to do anything if something happens there? What has been pushed out by FEMA is that we wouldn't even have to do exercises for the small nuclear reactors because, again, there is no protective action when something goes wrong, because outside of the planning zone around the reactor, radiation levels would not exceed those thresholds that I went through earlier. So, but it's also a great opportunity to practice if you practice with those, and not just limit your practice for radiological emergencies to just the power plants. So in Virginia, we're kind of trying to decide, do we want to do some voluntary exercises involving the small modular reactors once those are built, just to give us more practice on the rep side. But no, they're not the same maps at all.
And then where are the portal monitors? And wouldn't the people checking evacuees for contamination be in PPE?
So
Oh, go ahead, Susan. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the portal monitors are maintained in the jurisdiction in which in the jurisdiction responsible for opening and manning the evacuation assembly center. So all of their survey equipment and everything is kept locally. Where, I don't know. If it's in some instances it's in a closet at the school that's going to be used as the EAC. But again, that's going to be maintained by the locality. And then the second part of that, I'm sorry, the PPE question. So yeah, the picture that you see was an exercise, because thankfully we've not had to do one of these for real. But the local emergency management procedure will prescribe what level of PPE the emergency workers wear. From what I've seen, at a minimum, they would be asked to wear gloves and shoe covers. And just depending on the situation, they may be asked to actually don more protective clothing at that point. But at a minimum, they would be wearing gloves and shoe covers.
So physically, the portal, once it's set up, can be all kinds of different places in an EAC. It can be at a doorway to enter. It can be outside. It can be inside. As you transition from one area to the next, it just depends. They all set them up differently. And the thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, and we get this question a lot, because even the state field teams who go into the plume don't wear protective clothing in an exercise, because Virginia does their exercises in July. And if you're in a Tyvek suit and a respirator in July for 4 hours standing outside in the sun, you actually put them in danger by doing that beyond the normal running of the exercise. So what you usually see in exercise pictures is people in street clothes, and what they do to demonstrate the ability to use PPE is they don it, put it on, and then they take it off, and they show the ability to do that without contaminating themselves or others. And then once that's done, the evaluators are fine, and then they just do the rest of the demonstration in their street clothes.
Great. Okay, last one, and then I think y'all have some questions for the participants. You covered air release. What about water?
So you mean contaminated? I need more info, because is this contaminated water leaving the plant? Because contaminated water doesn't leave the planting zone. If you're talking about contamination getting into the water supply, that's something that we deal with later on in an incident. So we're not concerned about that during. So there's really 3 phases. There's the plume phase, or the early phase. That's when there's the actual release of airborne contaminants to the environment. Essentially, you have to think about it this way. Everything in the power plant is crazy hot, right? So the water very quickly becomes steam if it isn't already steam. And so it's an airborne release. Then we have the intermediate phase after the plume phase, where we're kind of trying to get a feel for what just happened, how bad is it, how far out is the contamination. And then we have what's called the recovery phase, where we actually go out and start taking environmental samples, soil, vegetation, water, various other medias. And we start looking at the amount of radiation in those various matrices to make determinations of, can people return to that area or not? Can they consume food from that area? Can they drink the water from that reservoir, or that sort of thing? A water release from the plant, if there's contaminated water that spills, it just stays within the planting zone around the plant. They call it the what do they call that thing, Susan? Why can I not think of that? The plant, what is it called?
The owner controlled area?
Yeah. There's various names, and for whatever reason I can't. I'm brain farting right now. But anyway, there's a distance around each plant that they consider their planting zone around the plant. I think it's about a mile at North Anna, and it's like 0.3 miles at Surrey. So again, a liquid release stays inside of that, and there's going to be no contamination outside of that that'd be worrisome to the public if it's purely water, liquid.
So did you want to do your questions? What's the text?
We had kind of talked with Adrenia about maybe doing as a poll. So yeah, so what's the easiest way? Are you going to read them to them, Adrenia?
I see them over there in the right, in
I
the
just can't
chat.
see the whole question.
Oh,
Do you want me to read the questions? I can pull up the presentation and read them, or does somebody
And they
else?
should be presenting now for individuals to see if they can, if they don't already see the poll, there's 3 little dots in the bottom of their screen. If they click on that, they will see the option for polling, and click on polling, and they can see the questions and answer those.
How do you see the whole question? Because oh, I see. If you hover over it, you can read the whole question.
Okay, so that was question 1.
It's kind of hard because you can't see all the choices.
may have to resort back to the old fashioned way, right?
And I can do that as well. I have them up if you want me to go ahead and share my screen. I can do that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I think that might.
Okay.
If
Because I can't see all the
I
choices.
can't either. I can't see anything, so.
Even when I popped it out and expanded, I could finally read all the answers and choices, but I couldn't figure out how to pick one.
Yeah,
Okay, you can go ahead and read those, Matt or
All
Susan.
right, so question 1 was, which answer shows the 4 emergency classification levels used during a radiological event at either the Surrey or North Anna nuclear power stations in their correct order in terms of severity, lowest to highest? And then the choices are there. I don't know. We don't have to, you can just maybe answer to yourselves. And I know some people have backgrounds in nuclear power, and those people commenting is unfair.
I know.
It's like when the Navy guys come to our training and they already know everything. So I personally would go with D. I think D is the real answer. And that's generally what we hear from the public. So if everybody's looked at it, the correct answer is C. That's the correct answers for the 4 emergency classification levels and their advancement. Where this might be important is if you're working in an EAC, is maintaining awareness of that. The EAC should already have awareness of that, and also the local emergency management is going to have awareness of that. But this may be something because it allows you to know when you can start expecting evacuees. You're not going to expect evacuees at a unusual event, alert, or a site area emergency. If you want to go to the next question. Okay, so at which of the emergency classification levels can radiation be released from the plant to the environment? So hopefully everybody remembers what I said about that one.
Yep, and I'm kind of looking at the chat, so if yeah, there we go. Everyone can kind of put their answers in chat.
All right, so we're kind of running short on time, so I'm just going to say it. So the answer is E. It's all the above. So you can have a release of radiation to the environment at any of the alert classifications or the emergency classification levels. So that actually, I pointed this out before. The exercise we had for Surrey this July was the most complex scenario I've ever dealt with. I don't know why Dominion did it. I applaud them for doing it because it really challenged things. That had a release that started at a notice of unusual event and continued throughout the thing. The scenario actually played with a release that did not exceed any of those factors that I discussed, but sat right at that level where it was just below where we do something at site area emergency. So it really challenged the players because they knew the public was in a radiation field outside of the plant boundary. As a matter of fact, 5 miles from the plant, they were getting readings 200 plus times normal background, but it did not exceed the action levels that drive you to go to a general emergency and then an evacuation. So it really challenged the situation. But again, it's all of the above. All right, so which of the following is a protective action used primarily during hostile action-based events like a terrorist attack? C.
Yeah,
When in doubt, pick C.
I think everybody is getting this one.
Yeah, right. So it looks like in chat, yeah, it's B, it's shelter in place. Again, we don't want good people mingling with the bad people. And pretty much what we've been told by state police is if they roll into the plant, they're shooting first and asking questions later. So you probably don't want to be out there when that's going on. So we can go on to number 4. All right, true or false? Protective action recommendation, or PARs, can be based on outside threats to plant security or safety, plant conditions, integrity of the fission product barriers, and or any radiological releases. All right, I figured everybody get this one. So again, it's true. Any of those can drive it, and there's even more stuff that can drive protective action recommendation that I didn't cover. So we can go on. Wow, why did I write that so long?
Oh, that's bad.
That's a terrible question.
That's
All right, let's see if we can narrow this down. All right, so we've done dose assessment, and it indicated that the radiation levels will exceed 1 rem total body dose, or TEDI, at 3.4 miles from the plant. Based on this information, the state has issued an expanded protective action decision, so that's approved by the governor, to evacuate all the PAZs included within a 5-mile circle around the plant in the areas between 5 and 10 miles in the 3 primary downwind sectors. Based on all that information, should potassium iodide be administered to the public? So I see a lot of C's. So here's the answer. And this is an answer that literally I would bet you at least half of my office wouldn't get right. So the answer is actually D. So TEDI is a completely separate thing. We base potassium iodide on thyroid dose rate, which is calculated in CDE. So the decision to recommend potassium iodide or ingestion is based on completely different factors than the protective action decision. And as a matter of fact, even though we have a thyroid dose as one of our protective actions, it's the adult thyroid dose that drives protective actions like evacuation. It is the child thyroid dose that involves or directs the ingestion of potassium iodide. And that actually creates some problems for us in Virginia because we can exceed the child thyroid dose rate, which drives us having to give potassium iodide without exceeding the adult dose rate, which would drive an evacuation. And if you heard everything we said, we give out the potassium iodide at the evacuation assembly centers. So how do you give it out if there's no evacuation? So that's one of the things that we're dealing with as a REP program in Virginia. I believe in the past, they actually at one point gave out potassium iodide to everybody in the emergency planning zone. There's been talk about doing that again. The inherent problem in that was when they went to get it back from the people afterwards, some of the people were like, well, I took that the day you gave it to me because it's medicine, right? I want to go ahead and take it. Other people couldn't find it, so they went to get the old expired stuff back so they could throw it away and give them new, and they didn't know where they put it. Just like I can never find a light bulb in this house. So it's that kind of thing. So again, just something to keep in mind. Potassium iodide, completely separate decision than protective actions. All right, an EAC or evacuation assembly center should be located at least how many miles from the nuclear power station it's serving?
They got that one too.
I was going to say, I saw people put 15 in before the choices came up.
Yeah,
That's
I
good.
think that's an easy one.
Yeah, so that's 15. That's right. It's D, it's 15. All right. Which position or individual at the EAC is responsible for assigning staff to all the functional areas? Yeah, I figured everybody get that one too. By the way, Bob and Susan are two of the employees that work in my program. So I had to think of answers, so I just went with easy choices. All right, so it's A, the EAC manager. All right, if you're given the responsibility of helping register evacuees at the EAC, what's the first thing you should check for? Yep, and everybody's getting this one pretty straight. So yeah, again, you want to make sure they have that clean stamp, meaning that they've went through monitoring and decon and have been considered at this point to either be clean initially or properly decontaminated. Who has the authority, which person in the Commonwealth of Virginia has the authority to recommend that potassium iodide be ingested by the general public during a radiological emergency?
Yep.
Yep, very good. So it's the state health commissioner. I will say this, 99 times out of 100, that is delegated to what we call the ESF8 lead. So it's essentially the person from our office that's managing the event from the ESF8 little cubicle, if you will, at the EOC, the state health commissioner, but they are briefed when that decision is made. All right, an object or person being screened at an EAC is considered contaminated if their readings are how many counts per minute above background? Yep,
They were listening.
everybody paid attention to Susan's stuff.
I'm impressed.
Yep, so it's 300 counts per minute above background is considered contaminated. Anything below that, even though it's detectable, it's not considered to meet the criteria for contaminated. I will say this to you. I think when that meter starts beeping, it doesn't matter to that person. They want it off and they want to be clean. And that's one of the things that you might have to deal with as a subject matter expert at an EAC is explaining to someone why the meter and the portal monitor both went off. Portal monitors are crazy sensitive. So they'll go off even when the meter doesn't pick up stuff. So again, somebody could be 100 counts per minute above background. If you've ever heard 100 counts per minute above background, the meter is screaming. But it doesn't mean that they're contaminated by definition. Name 2 areas of a vehicle that should be surveyed or screened for contamination. Yep. So I see a lot of people at the end here who took the time to read all the answers.
Yeah.
So it's E, right? So I guess you could check those other things, but they're under the hood and they probably aren't contaminated
Well,
and probably aren't really good.
I like Andrew's answer, Matt, if you can jump over and see it in chat.
I didn't see it. What was it?
He says, or the nut behind the wheel, which is very true.
You could do that as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that we didn't cover that they almost always tell people to do is the grill.
Mm-hmm.
You're driving through it, you're sucking air through the grill. The other thing you'll see people talk about doing is checking the air filters, either the engine air filter or the cabin air filter. All right. Which position or individual at an EAC briefs the emergency workers?
Bob.
So in our drills, Bob actually briefs our emergency.
He literally does.
He's always our safety officer for the state field team. So,
But I can see this might have been a little confusing because some people are picking B, which is kind of correct because the EAC manager does provide briefings to the EAC workers. But I think what we were going for here is, again, kind of what Cole just mentioned. It depends what we're briefing them on. So they're, you know, the exposure control officer is going to be briefing emergency workers on their, you know, dosimetry, their function for monitoring and surveying and decontamination. So yeah, it kind of differs.
yeah, I will say probably the initial talk to everybody is going to be the EAC manager, but
Yeah.
when they're doing change out of shifts, the emergency workers are probably not going to go to see the EAC manager. They're going to go directly to that exposure control officer.
That's right.
And again, we ask these kind of questions because in case you're ever at an EAC and people come and, hey, I'm here to be a part of the monitoring team. Where should I go? Just help me to direct them. Okay. These are open-ended questions. So I'll leave that up to the folks from the volunteer program to decide how we want to answer these, whether it's type it in chat or maybe open it up through the put your hand up and talk. But we'd like to hear your thoughts on how you'd handle some situations. So the first situation is a family of 4, a father, a mother, and 2 children just passed through the portal monitor, and the father only set off the alarm, and he has been segregated for additional screening. The mother and children are very confused and upset. You're asked to speak with the mother about what's going on. What would you say to her? Mike or Adrenia, how do you want to have them answer that?
I see one person's got their hand raised. I don't know if you can unmute them, Adrenia.
They have to unmute themselves at this point. They're already unmuted on my end.
So that's me. I'm Roberta. And so I think the key here is to not panic the family. And so basically reassure them that, yeah, there's an alarm that went off, but we're evaluating to see what the significance of that is. And, you know, if it turns out that it's a high level and there's a concern, then you'll address that later. But at the get-go, I would just be very reassuring with the family.
I think that's a great answer. That's the number one thing that people are going to need is just somebody to reassure them that that buzzer's not the end of the world,
Right.
and stuff. So that's a great answer. If anybody else has anything else, I'm, welcome to hear it, but I think that's a pretty good answer.
Yeah, and there's some good answers in chat. I'm kind of reading those, Matt, as we're talking, and everybody's kind of, on the same page with that. It's try to make sure that they're calm and just be compassionate, right?
And one thing that keeping in mind that we can do as volunteers is things like, if the mother's upset, maybe we can go and volunteer to take the kids to a room to color or something so that she can speak to someone without having to worry about her children. Again, these people are dealing with an extremely stressful time for them. A nuclear power plant incident is just stressful, right? So again, great answer. We can go on if y'all want. I know we're getting late. You're assigned to registration at an EAC and directed to greet persons coming from the screening stations and then direct them to an open table for processing. An elderly gentleman approaches you and you note he does not have a clean stamp. What should you do if that individual becomes agitated or demands to know what's going on? So I saw in chat something that said, ask the person to step aside so you can explain what's going on. I think that's good. Explain the purpose of the clean stamp and why you're looking for it. Reassure the person that there's nothing wrong. You just want to make sure that we're following the right protocols. All that's really good answers. I will tell you one of the biggest things that they push in training for radiological emergencies, and they do this down in Anniston, Alabama, is they almost always send somebody through your line who's either drunk, not really, they pretend to be drunk, but maybe they are really, I don't know. But they'll send somebody through that's drunk or they're just unruly. And the whole point is to challenge the EAC folks or the folks doing the screening of how do you deal with this? The other thing that they love to do is send like a kid through who won't stand still, right? And you're trying to monitor them and they're all over the place. But again, it's explaining why do you need this, all that stuff, and why do I need you to go back and get that clean stamp? It's really for your benefit. You can explain that as well. Not knowing whether they've been screened and decontaminated, they could actually be contaminated, which is a danger to themselves and to others. All right, and then I think there's only one more question. To themselves and to others. So I'll just let y'all read this one, and then you can.
And Matt, this may be, the same response that we've kind of talked through in the other questions, right? Yeah, here come the answers now.
And I actually really like the one that just popped up, which is because you didn't set off the stuff, any exposure that you had or contamination would not be a medical concern, right? And explaining that's why we're not worried about doing anything more with you. I think that's the biggest thing. People do not understand the relationship between exposure, contamination, and death. And they kind of put those always together. If I'm exposed to radiation, I'm gonna grow 3 heads. There's no other option. That's what's gonna happen. Or I'm gonna get cancer. It is just 100%. And they don't realize that they're exposed to radiation every day. They don't realize how much radiation is involved with a chest x-ray. And they can't put those things together. So again, I think that kind of stuff would be really good. And again, just reassurance, right? You're okay. We know you're okay because we screened you, and everything was clean. Now, the one thing I will say, it's very, very unlikely, right? But screening someone's vehicle does not mean that the person's going to be clean, right? Because they could have walked out and gotten in the vehicle and not touched anything that we would have screened. So unlikely, but possible.
Hey, Matt, I think you're muted if you're talking.
Sorry. I see it. Yeah, I don't know what happened. So I was saying, I think that's all the questions we have. Can you hear me now, Mike?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I was saying, I think that's all the questions we have. I said thank you to the gentleman who said he didn't answer because he was a former Navy guy. That's appreciated. I saw there was a bunch more questions in the chat. We can try to go back through that and try to answer some more of those. Susan and I are pretty much booked for the remainder of this week, and a good portion of next week, but we can try to get to that. And then the last thing I'll leave with is, Mike, I don't know if you want to talk about the upcoming training at all, or if you want to do that separate.
Yeah, so we haven't announced this yet, but we're looking at a date in September, and I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head. But there was the second mission that we had talked about, and that was the non-plume zone monitoring team, the team that would go to areas that aren't affected by the pad decision and just go in and verify that the radiation levels there are at the expected background level, so that we can just be confident in the decision that was made. That training will actually be in person and will involve some hands-on, with the equipment that Matt has. That's going to be in the Richmond area. I know we've got team members in this group that are located up in Northern Virginia, and then some in the eastern region, Virginia Beach, Norfolk area. So we're looking at potentially doing some additional training events in other locations. But the first one will be in Richmond. It'll kind of be our first walkthrough with this kind of training. But that announcement will go out the same way the announcement for this training went out. And then also wanted to put your attention on the screen. So we have the method for recording your attendance, and basically it's going back to the train course and completing the post-training survey. And once you complete the survey, we'll be able to verify that you attended the training and give you full credit for it. And Adrenia or Kate, am I missing anything?
Nope, that's it. And I also put it in the chat with the direct link right to go back to the course.
And someone asked, how do we know which team you are putting this on? So we didn't assign you, you guys assigned yourself. So back when we did the interest meeting, there was a form to go in and sign up. So if you got the alert for this training, you were signed up for this specific team, the EAC support team. Many of you selected that you wanted to be on both teams, and so I did put you on both teams if that was your choice. So when I go to do the alert for the other training, it'll be based on everybody who signed up specifically for that role or for both roles. So if you only sign up for EAC, you won't get that other alert, but everyone else will.